Hello, welcome to Flying for Money. I'm Stan. I'm going to be doing a little reaction video today. Online, I noticed 747 Gear, online personality, some of you may know him, dropped a video relating to a departure takeoff with the 737 crew. I don't know exactly where it's out of. It maybe was out of Miami. There's a thunderstorms, looks like, in the area, and he had some comments about it. I'm a 737 captain. I'm a 737 guy. This is a 737 we can see here. You can tell by the displays that it is a 737 MAX. So it's a 737 MAX aircraft these guys are flying. 737 Gear, there's some things I agree with them. There's a few things he said which were, I think, pretty incorrect. Some things misguided. He was critiquing the crew, so I think it's fair to critique him back. And so let's hop into it.
And sometimes get yourself into a bit of a trap. It has happened to me, but this is a little bit of a different situation with this video. You can see that they're taking off and the flashes are happening right here at the airport. Now this can be tricky because this is filmed on a GoPro or something like a GoPro, so judging distance is a little bit tricky. And I'm not there in this situation. There have been flights that I've been in, flying in thunderstorms just recently, that if you were in the back, you would think Kelsey has lost his mind. What is he taking me into? So sometimes you get yourself worked up into.
So what he's talking about here is the lightning strikes that you can see in the background. Now, he notices that this is a GoPro type of camera. He feels as though his expression, I think he's actually right. I think the lightning may be further away than it looks like. He's sort of technically wrong because GoPro cameras have wide angle lenses which make things look further away than they actually are. He thought that it might make it closer. It doesn't. But they also have very limited dynamic range. And if you're a camera geek like I am, dynamic range it's sort of the range of brightness that a camera can depict, which is much less than the human eye can depict. So your shadows to your highlights, the dark areas to the blooms of light become compressed so that if your exposure is set for the cockpit like it is here, and you have a light that's slightly lighter, slightly brighter than what you have in the cockpit, it appears to be a big bright bloom, when in fact it may just be a very, very, very dim sort of light in the sky. So I think this weather may have been a little bit further away. You can see when the radar pops up, looks like it's at least 5 miles away, if not further away. 5 miles away, looks like there's some rain showers. You'll see depictions of granular sort of red, indiscriminate red, sort of splotchy red, which on a radar is probably downdraft rain. So it's possible the lightning may have been much further away than that. It could have been 20 miles away, 20 miles away. If it's just in one part of the sky, you certainly can make a turn on your way out. So that's what he's referring to here. I think he's right. I think it's a little bit further away than it appears, but that's the technical details of why that would be correct, why it looks closer in the video itself.
To a corner and you don't really have a lot of options. That's not really the case with this video and what these pilots are doing, but that's not even what annoys me. I'm going to explain to you what annoys me the most later on, but first let's check out this video.
Set takeoff thrust and one toggle. B1.
Now, I don't know the procedure of this airline, so I'm not going to get into any of the small features or opinions on his flying or flying style or whatever. I wouldn't want someone criticizing some of that stuff about me. So that's not really the point here that I want to make. But you may have noticed here that there's lightning going off directly in front of the plane before they even start their takeoff roll.
I can say this as well. I agree with them here. I have certainly taken off in situations that haven't looked much different than that. I mean, to the naked eye, if it looked like that, it would appear as though the lightning was right over the field. I wouldn't take off with lightning right over the field. But I've taken off in situations where certainly you've seen lightning strikes in the sky. It looks kind of intimidating. It looks kind of tough. But with the right radar information, which isn't just radar aboard the aircraft, we have Wi-Fi, cellular devices, iPads. Most people have them now. Pretty much all the airlines have them. And you have apps on there that'll give you a 5-minute weather, the weather that it was within the past 5 minutes. You can see where the weather is moving. You can see where it is around the airport. It's 360 degrees. You can see if there's going to be an easy turnout. And of course, as you're sitting there prior to taking off, if it's a relatively busy airport that you're departing from, say it's Miami Airport, there may be a steady stream of departing aircraft, and they're going to depart. They're going to make a turnout wherever the departure controllers are going to send them, and they're going to be sending reports back related to what sort of ride quality they had on the climb out. So if it's just a little bit of light chop or light turbulence, everyone's reporting along the flight path that the departure controllers are giving them, and you have that information, you may not be overly concerned with these blooms of light that you're seeing outside of the aircraft. I would say those lightning strikes appear to be off to the right side of the aircraft. It doesn't even appear to be along the aircraft's flight path. And when the radar sort of pops up here in a minute, you'll see that it's kind of off to the right. And again, off to the left, you see it's a little brighter off to the left. So I'd assume that they're going to take off and plan on turning to the left away from the weather.
But something else that caught my eye was the radar. It's on, but it's not painting anything. Now our radars can scan left and right, and they always are scanning left and right, but they can also scan up and down. So we're able to tilt them up or tilt them down, because if you're climbing, you want to see the weather above you, or if you're descending, you want to see the weather below.
Now, there's something that he does here that I think probably informs the situation a little bit. So you can see this airplane image that he gives is a 747. His channel is 747 gear. I believe he's a 747 captain, cargo guy. And he's talking about old school radar systems, which I've used over the past. I'm a 737 captain, as I've said. I have a lot of experience in the aircraft. This is a MAX, which are the newest version of the 737s. And they come with auto functioning on the radar, on the weather radar. The 737-800s come with that as well, the newer 737-800s. On Airbuses, which I've flown as well, they refer to them as multi-scan. It's auto on the 737. It actually controls the tilt, and it will move the tilt. So what he's saying here, what he's getting into is, in a climb, you want tilt up because the weather's above you, and that's the direction you're heading up. And in cruise, he shows straight ahead. You actually want a little bit of a tilt down in cruise, particularly in a jet. If you're up in the mid-30s, 35, 36,000 feet, the weather beneath you, I mean, most moisture is going to be beneath you. You can have weather that you don't want to fly directly in front of you, but you're not going to depict much precipitation above 20, 25,000 feet because everything's frozen. And radar really is good at depicting liquid droplets. It's not really good at depicting frozen droplets or hail. And so you kind of want to have that thing pointed down a little bit in cruise to see what's beneath you. You're really concerned if you're going to be flying over something that you're within 10,000 feet of going over the top of, and there's big returns. If it's more than 10,000 feet beneath you, you may not be as concerned. And then in descent, obviously, you want to have the radar pointed down as well. With manual radar systems, the controller, the operator, the pilot is responsible for twisting a knob that selects the tilt, and then on the screen, it'll show you what tilt that you're at. So you want to manually control the tilt. And this is an auto system on the 737 MAX. You can take it out of auto, but the standard operating practice is to leave it in auto. And it does this multi-scan. We'll do one sweep at one angle, then it'll pitch up and do another sweep at another angle, then it'll pitch up and do another sweep at another angle, and it'll do that for multiple different angles of scan, and then it aggregates those multiple sweeps into one image. So it gives you the moisture across a larger vertical area of the sky. Whereas the regular scan method, your radar sweep may be 5 degrees in scope vertically, and so you're only seeing what's in that 5-degree sweep. So if you're within 5 or 10 or 20 miles of a return, you may actually be shooting over the top of that return with your radar. It's not going to show much, but you may only be within 2,000-3,000 feet of the tops of something that you don't want to be flying through. So multi-scan really solves that. It does have the tendency, especially in cruise, to overestimate what you might find in certain areas. So when we come out of multi-scan, we typically come out of it and then we take the sweep, we point it in the direction, typically a few degrees down, and if we have a place where we can penetrate, that'll depict it for us, because we're not concerned about flying 15,000 feet over big returns. Multi-scan may give me that on my return, and I may want to say, well, I have this huge line of red. Can I go through here anywhere? And huge lines of reds, by the way, could be from the Mexico border to the Canadian border. I mean, I've seen that before, just all the way up. Are we going to be able to penetrate? If we can't penetrate, we're just going to go somewhere else. We're going to delay. We're going to wait for it to pass, whatever we need to do. But a lot of times that's not necessary. So multi-scan, when we come out of it to go to this pitch. I assume the 747 he flies probably has manual pitch. He may not have seen the auto pitch. 737 MAX has auto pitch. You will see radar returns that indicate that it was in the auto mode during the takeoff. So he's discussing this here a little bit. To the point that he's discussing it, this is valid for individuals who don't have auto mode, that you do have to concern yourself with what exact pitch that you're going to have on takeoff. The other thing that auto scan does, you're going to talk about maybe this scan being too low. If it was too low in manual, you'd see a lot of ground return. The auto scan will actually remove the ground. So it'll do multiple sweeps, and it can depict what's ground and what's actually liquid precipitation, and it'll remove the ground returns from the radar, so you just have the precipitation. It's a pretty neat product.
Below you, so we're able to change those pitches while it's scanning left and right. Now, I don't know at this stage, is the pilot not have his radar on at all, which is possible, or are they pointing it at a different angle, or is it broken?
His radar was on, by the way. We'll see it here in a minute. You can see both the captain and the first officer. Their hands don't go down to where the radar control panel is. The 737 MAX on the captain's side, it's down. It's down about over here. It's aft of the throttles on the captain's side, and neither one of them reach their hands down there. There's also a mode selector that you could select the radar mode. Neither one of them reach up there to select. So the radar was on during takeoff. I think the auto scan feature where it begins sweeping different regions of the sky didn't activate until they got 80 knots ground speed approximately, or whatever it's programmed for. I think at that point, then you'll start to see it sweeping different areas of the skies, pitching up to pitching down to, pitching down further and pitching back up. And then you start to see some radar returns populate.
But with having lightning going on, there's probably some type of precip out there. And before we take off, typically in any type of weather situation, we push this button here, and what that does is it allows for this main screen to show bad weather in front of me. An alternative option for that screen is to put terrain up there, which basically will put just big blocks of terrain that's up in front of you. Now, that's not an either or. Basically what it means is that if you're flying in a really mountainous area, sometimes you'll have one guy on radar and one guy on terrain. It's up to you.
What he's referring to here, when you see the video itself, the captain is on terrain mode, and you can kind of see the splotches. That's terrain mode, the reds, the greens, and the yellows. And the first officer is on weather radar mode. He goes into a little bit of detail. I don't necessarily disagree with his conclusion here, which is that you don't have to monitor terrain on the captain's side. It's not a bad idea if you're in an area with terrain for one person to monitor terrain while the other monitors weather. It would be kind of standard for the pilot monitoring to monitor terrain, the pilot flying to monitor weather, but you can do it either way. But if you're out of Miami, for example, and terrain's not a concern, then you probably want, with weather like that out there, you probably want both sides on weather radar.
If you don't have terrain up though, and you both have radar up because the weather is bad, like in this situation, if you both have weather up and you do start flying directly into a mountain, that doesn't mean that you're not going to see it. It's still going to override, because at the end of the day, your plane's going to do better going through a storm than it is going through a mountain. But usually one will have one will have the other, just so you know in advance for situational awareness. But in a case like this, where there's a thunderstorm, you might both be on weather, because as you approach a mountain, let's just say, it's going to switch from weather to terrain, just so you know. But those are the options. When I see nothing here on the screen, at first it's strange, but then you'll notice as he rotates, all of a sudden, a bunch of weather starts forming on a screen, which leads me.
Once again, you didn't see anyone grab any switches or pushes any buttons, so it was already set up. I think the multi-scan didn't start controlling the sweep until I got to a certain ground speed, whatever that is, that it activates. It's possible the sweep was too high, and so it didn't initially grab that weather that was just off to the left of their path, or it was too low and it didn't grab it off to the left of the path. And then once they started moving and the sweep started going through its multi-scan mode, its multiple pitch angle mode, mode, then it depicted that weather which you saw on his screen.
Leads me to believe that he probably had his radar set to go directly straight, like 0 or maybe up 1, but not up enough to know what is out in front of them before they rotate and take off flying into the weather. So he's probably got it at a very shallow pitch up, which...
He's wrong about that. I'm almost 100% sure that he's wrong about that. If this was a standard radar that was pitched low, you'd be getting ground return on the screen. And with the auto mode, the way that it populates, no one changes the pitch as they're rolling down the runway. It just suddenly populated some returns. That's the auto mode auto scan, which would be the standard mode for operation for the 737 MAX.
Which is strange if you're taking off into a thunderstorm. Still not a big deal. I've seen people do that. I've also seen planes get onto the runway, stop here, give it 10 or 15 seconds, and let their radar do a full sweep pointing upwards so that way they can see exactly what's in front of them and how far out it is. Which is typically what I do if I'm taking off and there's any type of question of what type of weather we're going to be getting into. I want to know, what is my screen saying? Air traffic control is going to have their radar, but there's been times in my life, the one I was recently even, where air traffic control walked me into a really bad corner with a bunch of weather and I didn't have any choices. So I typically like to
control is either very good or very bad when it comes to weather. They're usually pretty good, and if you're dealing with approach controllers around major airports, they're usually pretty decent in terms of they have good fidelity weather radar. For the most part, their weather radar is probably tuned a little too strong. They don't always know if they're getting a return, how high that return is. So a lot of times they get pilot reports
to them, and there are places that are better than others, like Miami, great with weather, thunderstorms and stuff, really good. Probably not great with getting you around mountains. So every airport and every area has great things where they're really strong at and really weak at. But I always like to trust but verify. I'm just not a trusting person, so I'll get onto the runway.
Trust but verify. I agree 100% with them there.
Let my radar do a full sweep of that area, and then we take off. And if it's all red, it's like a great wall of red out there, then I'm not going to do it. There was a case when I was a new FO, I told a story about it, but we got onto the runway, there was a bunch of thunder showers towards the end of the runway, and I don't think there was lightning, but there was a lot of thunder, there were some showers there, some really heavy rain, and I said, I'm not really comfortable with this, I don't want to take off. And the captain's like, cool, let's go. And we got off the runway, we waited 5 minutes, that storm passed, we took off and flew, and it wasn't a big issue. That was my buddy PJ. You've heard me talk about him back in the day. That was me and PJ flying. He was like, no big deal. He said while we were waiting at the end of the runway, he was like, I'm comfortable with that. And I have a lot more flying experience. He had thousands of hours that time, and I had hundreds. So he goes, I felt fine with it, but if you're not comfortable with it, no big deal. 5 minutes isn't going to make us or break us. So that just shows how
PJ is a very good captain. That's a perfect response in that type of a situation where you're flying with someone a little bit new. They're a little bit behind the airplane because they're a little bit new. You feel comfortable. You say you're probably not in love with the situation. You look at some radar returns, but you know the difference between aggressive turbulent returns, which are very, very distinct. They have very sharp boundaries, and precipitation types of returns, which are much more splotchy. You may have also looked at on your iPad or your iPhone or whatever pre-flight, and you know the weather that's in the area. You know if there's escape routes and turns you can make out, so you can feel pretty comfortable with it. But if the guy sitting next to you or the gal sitting next to you isn't comfortable with it, then they would be what we would call in the yellow, which means that they don't have a wide view. And if they only have a couple hundred hours, they're starting off without a very wide view of everything that's going on and everything they need to pay attention to. If they feel a little bit threatened, all of a sudden they get more tunnel vision and they're going to be halfway checked out. They're going to be just totally focused on the weather. They're not going to be thinking about other things. They're not going to be much assistance to you if something goes wrong. So the correct thing there is, hey, we're okay flying this, but you know what? If you're in the yellow, if you're feeling threatened, we're going to pull it over to the side. We can have a discussion, we can make you feel better, or we can just wait a few minutes, let this pass through, and then we'll take off and we'll all be in the green. So that's a great response by a captain.
How great PJ was. But getting back to this guy here, my guess is that this pilot has the radar turned probably too low.
I do have to say here, I think 737 gear, he's really focused on the first officer who's filming this and the pilot flying. Ultimately, the one I think that was posting this on social media, Kilo Delta 21. Let me add one thing here real quick because he never gets around to it. You're not supposed to for airline pilots, you are not supposed to film. I don't know any airline that doesn't have a policy that explicitly forbids filming while you fly. So a guy who's filming while he flies is outside of policy initially. And, you have the captain sitting next to him. I don't know if he knew the camera was on or not. I wouldn't allow someone to film in that situation because your ticket's kind of on the line. The FAA really doesn't like it. If you're procedurally, intentionally non-compliant, that's a very bad thing. If something goes wrong and they found out that you were violating a procedure intentionally, that's going to be very bad. And then this guy's sticking it up on social media for a bunch of people to see, which you get back around to chief pilots and the FAA. And they're going to, if the FAA sees this, which they probably will, they're going to start poking some bellies over at the airline if they can identify what airline it is and say, hey, who are these guys? Because they're not supposed to be doing this. If the captain wasn't aware of it, if he just sort of put the camera up there and didn't say anything about it, well, the captain's face is on the image right now. So
Of hours that time, and I had hundreds. So he goes, I felt fine with it, but if you're not comfortable with it, no big deal. 5 minutes isn't going to make us or break us. So that just shows how great PJ was. But getting back to this guy here, my guess is that this pilot has the radar turned probably too low, so they don't have any idea of exactly what's out there because his radar is scanning straight ahead instead of up enough. Watch what happens next.
Check. Enough speed. Intervention 200.
Pause it here right quick so you can see on the screen there, and I'll blow it up a little bit. The radar display. It doesn't look like it's a real big cell that's out there. Obviously, to the right you have a little bit of red. To the left you have green. You can fly through green. I mean, if you have to in a pinch, you can fly through green. You really don't want to fly through yellow, but if you have to, if you gotta, you can fly through yellow in one of these aircraft. You don't want to fly through red, but the red on the right is kind of indiscriminate. It's a little bit splotchy. Looks to me like it's probably more of a rain shower, but there may be some lightning mixed into it. So obviously if you can make a left-hand turn about 30 degrees here, you'll avoid the whole thing. And if you got to go punch through it, I guess you can. I assume they're going to make a left-hand turn. The video doesn't take it that far to see whether they make a left-hand turn or not. But just wanted to point that out. Pretty bright, but again, you can see the way that it blooms. It clips in camera terms, which means that the dynamic range is not very high in a GoPro. So that clipping, who knows how bright that lightning blast actually is.
Now, once you're up in the air, there's really not much you can do about it. When you're on the ground and you're looking up, you can go, okay, cool, I don't want to take off into that. Once you're in the air, there's really not much option. You're just going to have to pick around that storm the best you can. You're going to have to use your weather radar.
I'd say looking at what I saw, I don't know that I necessarily wouldn't take off. I'd probably be talking to him of, hey, I want a quick left-hand turn. Potentially that was already sort of in the plan. We don't know. We don't know any discussion beforehand, but be like, hey, when I take off on about a left 20, left 30 degrees, and then I'm going to avoid this entire thing.
You can see outside your aviation experience and your...
The other part of it, like I said, is people preceding you that are taking off, other pilots, other airlines, other 737s, exact same type of aircraft blasting off in front of you. If they're going through the middle of this green portion and they're just getting a little bit of light chop, yeah, okay. I mean, I'm probably going to go fly through that too if the last guy through is 2 or 3 minutes prior to me and they haven't reported anything significant. I'm not going to go fly through red. I don't care who's gone in front of me, but a little bit of green weather like that, if you can just punch right through and you've had some light chop, yeah, I'll go fly through that.
Weather experience and what the winds are telling you, and just do your best to get around that storm. That's really all you can do once you're at this stage, you're airborne, and okay, let's just get around it. Years ago, I made a video on this video flight, and I talked about how a pilot wouldn't intentionally take off into the storm because it would be stupid and unsafe. And I still feel that way. You can see once this plane rotated off the ground, the pitch angle, you could see what the radar was painting in front of them, and it was showing like it was pretty close to the front of the plane. I can't quite see the distance, but it's pretty close out there. You see here how it's showing this painting of the cells, the yellow and the red. That indicates that there's some weather.
You can see there, it's kind of splotchy red. So that's going to be in the dissipating phase, which means that it's principally rain. Again, if there's lightning in there, I'm not going to go fly through there. Even if there's not lightning, I'm probably not going to fly through red. I'm not going to lie and say I've never punched through a bit of that. Sometimes those red returns don't populate until you're right on top of it. If you're 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 miles away, given the calibration of the radar, it may be some splotchy yellows, and then you get right up next to it, it turns red, and it ends up, if it's splotchy like that, it ends up being rain. So you turn your igniters on and hope the engines don't flame out. They don't, for the most part. They're tested with a lot of water to ingest a lot of water, but you don't intentionally, if you have a little bit of room to maneuver, you don't intentionally fly through anything like that.
Close to the aircraft that you're not going to want to be flying into. Now, it appears they are staying below the clouds, which is great, but you can kind of tell how rough this ride is just by how much the pilot is controlling his yoke. The other thing that I want to tell you, if you're planning on being a pilot, that I don't like when people do this, and I don't think it's really the safest course of action, is this pilot is choosing to hand fly, which is fine under some circumstances. Hand flying means that the pilot who's flying is just doing that. He's just flying and giving instructions, and you can hear him saying things to the other pilot that he has to now do. That pilot has to do those things while talking to air traffic control, while looking at the weather radar, while the pilot flying is just like in his own little world of flying. That's all that he has to do, is be responsible for something that's really key in the whole thing, flying the plane. But what it does is it can load up the other pilot. The other pilot seems like he's handling it fine. I'm not saying that he's overloaded, but it does adds an extra amount of work for them instead of them both being able to monitor and see what's going on. What I typically would do and would want somebody to do if I'm in the other pilot's shoes is, let's turn the autopilot on, let's both look at the weather radar, let's be able to talk about that while the autopilot is flying. So it's kind of like having a third person there helping you. We can be discussing about the weather instead of you telling me the things that you want me to touch on the control panel. That's called the MCP. Instead of you telling me those things that you want me to do, we can be discussing, hey, how are we going to get around the storm and how are we going to handle this problem? But instead, he's choosing to hand fly. And the reaction that a pilot is going to have in order to keep the plane wings level or pitched up or whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing phase of flight wise, the autopilot is going to be able to do that much faster than any human, because it's going to be able to recognize and make those corrections faster than you as a human are going to read it, see it, have the flight director tell you what to do, and then you react. It's just not going to be as fast. And that becomes relevant.
Okay, so I'm going to disagree here. Probably disagree, like in argument, disagree, where we're kind of agreeing, but we're arguing in disagreement, if that makes sense. I don't necessarily disagree with the fact that if you're entering into a high workload phase, it's a good idea to turn the autopilot on. There's a few things. The 737 has kind of an odd auto speed system where the speed will, if it's in auto mode, it will draw the aircraft into acceleration and will respect flap retraction speeds. It'll take you to the speed that you want to be going, particularly in go-arounds. If you turn the autopilot on too soon, it'll take it out of auto speed mode and it'll put it into manual speed mode, which might be slower than you really want the aircraft to go. It may be below what we call maneuvering speed for a specific flap setting that you're at, which could get you into trouble if you get into a turn, because we always want to be at or above the maneuvering speed for the flap setting that we're at, or in the 737, the up bug if the flaps are up. And so the policy at the airline that I fly for is, you're not required. You can turn on the 737, you can turn on the autopilot at 400 feet, but in order to keep the go-arounds and the departures, the takeoffs as similar as possible, they suggest not turning the autopilot on until the flaps have been retracted, until the speed has accelerated at or above that up bug the auto speed setting has, so you don't trap it in manual speed and potentially put yourself into a bit of a situation. So he's complaining that, he agrees with me, I think, in saying that you don't have to turn the autopilot on as soon as possible. It's good for flying skills to actually fly. It's good for currency to actually fly the aircraft a little bit. But if you're in a high workload situation, maybe it's a good idea to turn the autopilot on. I don't disagree with that, but I don't know that this video goes on far enough to depict flap retraction and what this crew did after flap retraction. If he was waiting to flap retraction before he turned the autopilot on, then he may have just been following normal procedures. And if you turn the autopilot on too early, it's going to be a distraction to your crewmate because they're just used to flaps up before you turn the autopilot on. So probably less of a distraction just to fly it as you normally do. The other thing I disagree with is he says that autopilots are faster than humans. I don't believe that that is necessarily true. I think autopilots are very precise as it relates to maintaining a persistent, unwavering focus on following the flight director. That's what autopilots do. And so, in average, there's going to be less deviation, heading, airspeed, and some of these things if you're flying with the autopilot. But if you're in a wind shear type of a scenario, the autopilot, I mean, the 737, the first thing you do in a wind shear is autopilot off, auto throttles off, max thrust, pitch up 15 degrees, and then follow the flight director commands from there up to the stick shaker if you're descending and you're worried about contact with the ground. That's the immediate procedure. Autopilot off, auto throttles off. There's a reason why that's the immediate procedure. Autopilot off, auto throttles off is because the autopilot, even though it does a very good job of what it does, it will not respond aggressively with flight controls. And sometimes you need aggressive flight control responses. If you see this guy in this particular video during the takeoff, you can see he's working the yoke pretty aggressively. Autopilot's never going to work the yoke that aggressively. It can be an advantage in certain circumstances that it won't overreact, but it can also be a disadvantage if you're in heavy wind shear where you need aggressive flight control inputs in order to maintain control of the aircraft. The autopilot's not going to do that. So I disagree with him with that regard. If you're in a little bit of turbulence, I agree, and I'm arguing in disagreement is what I'm doing. So
if things start to go downhill, which I'll explain in a second. The problem with flying in this type of weather is that you have something known as a microburst. This is what a microburst looks like. It's basically a very powerful downforce of air that can press your plane straight into the ground if you don't properly respond to it. I've met people who have crashed, airline pilots that have crashed because of a microburst. There have been accidents that have happened. Dallas is probably the most famous one that happened as a result of a microburst. It's basically a really strong force of downward pressure of wind that's going to just force the plane onto the ground if you don't properly react to it. And it's just not that easy. The reality is like Mother Nature, if she wants to win, she's going to win. So you have to use every advantage that you can. So if you have a microburst, we get a lot of training of how to fly out of it. But guess what? A plane is going to fly out of it probably better than you are as a human.
Yeah, that's incorrect. That's not correct. The Boeing derived, maybe the 747, the autopilot, they leave the autopilot on when encountering wind shear or microburst. I've never flown an airplane, and there's 3 of them that would have sort of wind shear alerting systems, and in none of those 3 did you leave the autopilot on in a wind shear encounter. You don't leave the autopilot on in a wind shear encounter. The first thing you do is you turn the autopilot off. If you have auto throttles, you turn the auto throttles off. You pitch to 15 degrees. And you try to fly out of it. That's procedure in the 737. So I'm not entirely sure where his confidence interval here is, but autopilot on, it doesn't hurt to have the autopilot on, but if you get a wind shear, you're going to turn it off. So if you have it off in the first place, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Monitoring everything that's going on. Because if you're in this situation where you're hand flying and now you have a wind shear and now the plane is going to start going down, it's going to take you longer to react, to be able to get the autopilot turned on and get away from the ground.
I'm going to know something here because it's kind of funny. He's showing this, I think this is probably a 737 that he's showing. You'll notice the flight director is not on. So if the autopilot was on, the autopilot wouldn't do anything because the autopilot can only follow the flight director. So this is being hand flown. He's talking about the autopilot doing a better job of it, but in this case, it's being hand flown. And you can see on the PFD, you can see over there on the left, you can see the pitch limit indicator. So those little yellow tabs, and that's kind of what you're targeting. If you're close to the ground in a wind shear, you're going to fly that right up there. That's the highest angle that you can fly, the highest angle of attack on the wing before you begin to stall the wing.
Ground at a max power setting,
and an autopilot's not going to get you very close to that. By design, it won't take you to a very high angle of attack. So if you need a high angle of attack maneuver and you might need it close to the ground with wind shear, you're going to have to hand fly it.
You can imagine, microbursts are usually around thunderstorms like that. So I choose always in that type of a situation on the side of safety, let's turn on the autopilot, because if we do hit a situation where there is a microburst, I want to have the autopilot on, hooked up, and jam that thing, and let's go up as fast as we possibly can away from that, or use max power so we're getting away from the ground. Because if you hit a real microburst, you as a human aren't going to react as fast to stay away from the ground. It is going to be shoving you to the ground very, very fast.
Yeah, again, I mean, I just can't overemphasize how much I disagree with that statement. It may be policy in the 747, which I believe he's a captain on, to leave the autopilot on during a wind shear encounter. It is not in the 737. It was not in the Embraer 175 I was a check airman on. It wasn't in the Embraer 145 I was an instructor on. It wasn't in any of those aircraft. Every single one of those aircraft, you turn the autopilot off and you pitched relatively aggressively to 15 degrees up, and then if you needed to pitch further up towards the pitch limit indicator in order to, because you're concerned about contact with the ground, you'd go ahead and do it. The reason you do that is the autopilot doesn't do anything fast. It is very precise, it's very responsive to input commands, but it's relatively slow. It just will not give you aggressive pitch commands. It won't give you aggressive roll commands. If you need aggressive pitch or roll commands, it's going to be the pilot who's doing it.
I've done both in the simulator, so they want you to be able to do both, obviously. But the autopilot is going to do it better. And sometimes the autopilot can't handle it and it will kick it off. The autopilot just goes like, that's too much. That's outside of my limitation. Kick it off, and you have to be ready to grab it and fly it and do as good of a job as you can. And it's a hot mess. I mean, that plane is just getting slammed down. The shaker's going off. It's a very uncomfortable experience, especially when you're low to the ground like you just took off, and you're usually slower and heavier with fuel and all these other things. So it's not an ideal situation to be low to the ground, slow, hand flying near a thunderstorm, potentially near a microburst. So while I personally think it was a poor decision to take off into a thunderstorm like he is here, have it not tilted so he doesn't really know where he's going, and then choose to hand fly it into this storm like you see him doing, that wasn't even really what irritated me the most. It was actually his comments of what people were saying to him and what his reaction was to those comments that really started to irritate me the most. All of these things I don't think are great decisions. Obviously, the plane flew flying. Everybody got out of there. I'm sure there was a lot of people in the back that were very uncomfortable with the whole situation. You have to just trust that your pilots are going to make the best, safest move to help you get to where it is you want to go safely. That is the truth. And they obviously made it there fine, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was the safest course of action. But here's the thing. This guy is, I don't know, an influencer. He wants to be known or famous or wants attention, or he wants to educate people. I don't really know his intention. I haven't heard of him before, but he wants to post this online and have people see it. And the people had some things to say about it, and then here's his response. Now you can pause this video because these are going to go by kind of quickly, but these are some of the comments people left. Now they've been auto-translated on Instagram's auto-translate feature.
He does say here in this comment, the storm was not over the airport. And again, this is translated, I believe, from Spanish.
And obviously that's not always a correct, proper translation. The problem is when pilots get on social media and publish videos like this, the everyday person, passenger that's riding on the plane might look and think, wow, look how good of the pilot this is. They're flying through the storm and they're getting out safely. Me, meanwhile, if I'm sitting on the back and that pilot takes off, I'm sitting in the back going like, why are we taking off into a thunderstorm? I mean, I know the plane can take it. I mean, these planes can take so much abuse. It's ridiculous how much abuse they can take. I have been just recently in a way worse storm than that because I told you I got trapped into a corner, but I've been in way worse storms than that. So it's not that the plane can't take it. It can, but it's just not necessary. And if I'm sitting in the back as a passenger watching a pilot do this, I'm thinking like, what? No. Because I guarantee you, if you have this pilot doing this, the people in the back are stressing out, as you can.
So again, he's kind of focusing on the one pilot, which would be the first officer here who posted this on social media and was making comments. And, you know, part of what he's complaining about is sort of a sense of macho attitude. It's a hazardous attitude. You shouldn't be doing things on the basis of the sense of macho or proving yourself. You can get yourself into bad binds. He's correct with that. I don't disagree with that. But as it relates to actually flying, I think his complaints about the radar is incorrect. He is used to another system, another radar system. I think they were in auto mode, which was the correct mode for them to be in. I also think hand flying there was nothing wrong. We really don't see them to the point where the flaps are retracted. They're fairly low for most of this clip. And so we don't know when you turn the autopilot on. I don't necessarily disagree with, hey, if you're in that type of situation, once you get the flaps retracted in the 737, go and get the autopilot on. Then both of you can kind of be with it in terms of making decisions, making turns, things like that. Don't disagree with that. And but there's also two on board. There's a first officer and there's a captain, and so both of them perceived that there wasn't a sort of risk here. The first officer, maybe it's because he's a macho guy and he's always trying to prove himself. I don't know that the captain was necessarily the same sort of guy. So, and when I'm looking at the radar returns, I'm not thrilled about taking off in radar returns like that, but you ask me, would I take off in radar returns like that? Yeah, sure. If I can do a quick left turn to stay away from it, I would definitely consider going off into that. And then if I had people passing through the green portion of there off to the left a little bit, and they're reporting light turbulence in the climb, then yeah, sure, I'm going to tell the flight attendants remain seated, tell the passengers make sure your seatbelts are fastened, and then we're going to proceed. So anyways, I just wanted to add a few of my own thoughts, being a 737 guy and maybe being a little bit more familiar with the procedures of a 737. A few inaccuracies here. With regards to the first officer, I think I would have looked kind of sideways at him, being a captain, him putting that camera up. If he put it up and didn't tell me, I would have been very unhappy. And I would have been super unhappy if he put it up and didn't tell me and then posted it on social media, because he's putting the noose around my neck too. If he does that and the FAA sees it and they're going to come to chief pilots, it's going to become my issue as a captain. So to the degree, I think we sort of maybe agree in an argumentative way, me and 737 gear, where I'm not super happy with what this guy did. I'm not happy with him filming it and then putting it on social media. It's really, really a dumb thing to do if you're an airline pilot. I don't know any airline where that's permissible, where you're not going to have an issue, where the FAA, if they become aware of it, isn't going to try to find out who you are and have a conversation through the company with you, which potentially could be disciplinary. Don't put other people in that type of situation. If you are an airline pilot, don't bring the camera with you. Leave it at home, or go rent a 172 and you can film to your heart's content. Anyways, hope you enjoyed. Like and subscribe. See you next time.